So I'm going to go ahead and get started. I want to welcome you all. I'm John Wilkin. I'm the Dean of Libraries and University Librarian at the University of Illinois. And I'm pleased to present another wonderful presentation sponsored by the Library Friends of the University of Illinois. Today, I'm excited to share with you our colleague, Dr. Cait Coker. Cait is an associate professor and curator of rare books and manuscripts at the Rare Book and Manuscript Library. She's the co-editor of the Women in Book History Bibliography and the author of numerous articles and essays on the history of women in publishing and reading. I also want to note for you that Cait's book, The Global Vampire Essays on the Undead in Popular Culture Around the World, which has come out recently and you can find on Amazon, won the 2021 Lord Ruthven Award for Best Nonfiction. So, Cait, congratulations on that, a wonderful award. This award is named after one of the first vampires in English literature and is presented by the Lord Ruthven Assembly, a group of academics specializing in vampire literature affiliated with the International Association for the Fantastic and the Arts. So before we begin, I would like to remind you to mark your calendars for our next event, Identification of Historic Photographs and Their Preservation with Jennifer Hayne-Tepper on Thursday, April 22nd at noon. Look for an email invitation with registration details soon. And I will say that Jennifer's last lecture filled up quickly, so I'll encourage you to register promptly. So Cait, it's a thrill to have you. Take it away.
All right, thank you, John. So I'm going to start just with a couple of slides to kind of set the stage to talk about women printers in Europe and America. And I also want to also just kind of start, I know we're in virtual space, but I think it's important to remember that we are also in physical space. So I wanted to do just a really quick kind of land acknowledgement that we're currently on the lands of the Peoria, the Kaskaskia, the Piankashaw, the Wea, the Miami, the Mascoutin, the Ottawa, the Sauk, the Meskwaki, the Kickapoo, the Potawatomi, the Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations. I think that remembering these things when we're talking about reparative work is incredibly important. And I just kind of hope that that's something we can continue to look forward to in coming years, is how to continue to recover past histories and things. All right, so one of the things I kind of want to just kind of set in people's minds is kind of like the physical machines of printing. This is an image of two of the oldest surviving printing presses in the West. These are the Museum Planten Moretus in Antwerp. They date from around 1600. Oh, and by the way, lest I forget, if at any point folks have questions, please use that Q&A feature as part of your Zoom controls. We'll be kind of monitoring that. So if I say a word or a name or something you want just a little bit of clarification on as I go along, just feel free to use that. And I will be leaving time for a Q&A at the very end as well. So when you're looking at these machines, you kind of get an idea of, you know, the functionality and kind of like the physical challenges involved. Time goes on, technology evolves. By the 19th century, you're using steam-powered presses. They're using these magnificent and ginormous wheels. And you have people who are just constantly moving things, paper in and out of systems, just moving the type really, really quickly. And it's one of those funny things is the technology increases, the challenges increase. I just think that's fascinating. And then as we come closer to the modern arts movement, we kind of start going back and looking at older kinds of printing, going back to the hand press instead of, you know, more mechanical functions. And just to give you an idea of where I come from, I've taught printing for a number of years. On the left here is a picture of me just absolutely geeking out with the Reproduction Gutenberg press. This is what you would have roughly worked with from the 1450s through 1500. These were massive things, were actually adopted from olive oil and grape presses. So they were really big. And then on the right, there's a picture of me teaching at the book history workshop at Texas A&M, where I was formerly. I'm putting together the ink balls. So that kind of gives you an idea of like, I'm really interested in kind of like the physical processes of printing, as well as the people who did the work. And so now it's time to actually look at some books. So this, you can see this, I'm here in the library with our document camera. I've pulled several items from our collections to talk about. This is from 1488. This is an edition of Suetonius's De Grammaticis. This was printed by the Ripoli Nuns. The nuns of Ripoli, Ripoli is just outside of Florence. They were a small nunnery and monastery that were actually hit very hard by one of the plagues that rolled through Europe in the latter part of the 15th century. This is what's known as an incunable, which means it was printed during the cradle of printing. And to that end, during the early years of print, they were trying to kind of conscientiously like model the way that they were printing books on the way that you would present medieval manuscripts. And so you can see this little humble lowercase g right here for the Grammatica. The idea here was they would print the text and you would buy these sheets of paper. If you so desired, you could go to an illuminator or a scribe and have someone illuminate that nice little G for you. And that would kind of reproduce this feeling of the traditional written manuscripts that people at the time were more familiar with. One of the interesting things about the Ripoli Nuns is they left behind a very clear set of records about how they did things. It's called the Diario. There was a translation of it printed in 1999 by Melissa Conway. And you can look at like her translation, it's amazing the information. Like you have the listing of the nuns who were typesetting. You have a listing of the monks who were running the press. You have lists of how much things cost while they were starting this kind of fledgling business. And what you also get a sense of is how this printing business that they set up fit in with the other things that they were doing at the time. They also invested in a number of milk goats, and they would be selling milk as well as books. Now, one of the really interesting things to me is you think about this period of the 1480s, and what you see a lot of are religious texts. Consider that, of course, the first book printed in 1450 by Gutenberg was the Bible, and religious material was very popular. When you are choosing to do an educational text, that's very different. This is a standard work of grammar. Sorry, I'm kind of like scooting the camera so you can see a little bit better as I turn the pages. This was a book about grammar and rhetoric. It was an educational text. It was a secular text. It was also a classical text. It was written by Suetonius, who lived during the Roman emperors millennia ago. And so it's part of this kind of Renaissance rediscovering of classic books. And this is also one of only 3 editions of Suetonius's grammar that was actually printed in the incunabular period. So the fact that they chose this text is incredibly interesting. One of the things I'm going to be doing is kind of giving you guys a snapshot of different women during different periods of time. So we're going to fast forward a couple hundred years. This is a much bigger book, and you should be able to kind of just tell that from the way I'm struggling to keep it under the document camera. This is just a magnificent fat text. This is a Vulgate Bible, and it is printed by a woman named Charlotte Guillard in the latter part of the 16th century. Charlotte Guillard, it was considered the last widow printer, and what that means is that for about the first 200-ish years of printing in the West, what would happen is new printing shops were set up and so forth. Is probably not too surprising in an era of, you know, constant frightening mortality, is that printers would die and their wives would keep the shops going. Sometimes they would get remarried, sometimes they wouldn't, sometimes they would sell everything off, sometimes they would keep going. Charlotte Guillard was from a family of printers in Paris, and they were one of the major early kind of printing conglomerates. If you look down here, what you see is this is done by this is printed by the widow of Charles Guillard, as printed by Guillaume de Bois, and it is interesting because one of the things that kind of comes up is Charlotte Guillard is married 3 times and she's widowed twice. And when she's printing this book, she's still describing herself as the widow of Charles Guillard, when in fact her second husband, who was named William Chivon, had passed away. And she makes this conscientious decision to keep the name of Guillard all through her printing career, which is, it's just really interesting to me. Guillaume de Bois is her brother-in-law. He is part of this extended family who is also printing for decades. What you can kind of see, I hope, is just kind of like the shift in technology of like, for one thing, they are using different fonts, different sizes of lettering. They're using, they have italic lettering, they have the Roman lettering. They're using these all together. And see if I can do careful little tilt. You can see this is an absolute brick of a book. It's over 1,000 pages. It is a Bible with commentaries and also glossaries in Hebrew and Greek. And so one of the really interesting things about Charlotte Guillard is that she was kind of revered as an expert in Latin and Greek, to the point that she was actually commissioned, let me look at my notes. She was commissioned by the Bishop of Verona to publish his works. So she basically had an international reputation in the 16th century. She was known to have just an incredible correcting skill. When you look at here, you have the Hebrew text alongside of the Roman text. What you are thinking of is when you're a printer and you're trying to find by eye all the little errors that automatically can creep up. You know, typos go back forever, basically. So she would have been responsible just for the single edition of a book of going through 1,000 pages of text in multiple languages with multiple alphabets, and she would still get everything right. Okay, she was famous for that, and that's amazing to me.
Hey, Cait, I think we have a couple questions that we can probably take a break to answer, maybe.
Yes, please.
Okay, so a few that have come in since we started. Richard asks, did you say that the earliest extant printing press is from the 17th century? No earlier? None earlier?
Correct. It is from the 1600s. If there is anything earlier than that, no one is owning up to it.
All right. The second one from Helena is, what is the primary requirement for operating early printing presses? Physical strength, agility, endurance, brains?
All of the above. One of the things to kind of keep in mind is that there were multiple jobs involved in printing. So one of them was pulling the press bar, which would require not necessarily strength, but a willing to keep doing it over and over. They didn't have unions or any kind of job protections back then. So you would be working 12, 14, 16-hour days doing repetitive motion repeatedly. It's not the individual press pull that kills you, is doing it 5,000 times a day. You would have the job of the inker, who would be the person responsible for holding the ink balls, applying the ink to the type. That was a dirty job. And one of the primary cleaning agents at the time was chamber lye, which was boiled urine. That would have been a terrible job that maybe not required much in the way of like technical ability, but definitely just, you know, physical willingness to do that all days, plus again, repetitive motion. You would also have the job of one of the pressmen would be applying the clean pages that had yet to be printed to the press, and they would take off the pages after they had been printing. So their job would be to have clean hands at all times. Sometimes what you can see are actually thumbprints from people who failed at having clean hands at all times. You would have the typesetters who would have the job of very quickly actually setting type and composing sticks. There would be an expectation by the 17th century that you would be able to set 1,000 letters within an hour. I've done this for a number of years and I still can't do better than 1,000 characters over 2 hours. So people back then, I mean, it kind of boggles the kind of expectations they had. You would also have the corrector, again, like Charlotte Guillard, who would be expected to go through every single page and double check everything. Now, because of the historical expense of papers, this was a very important job, because if you had an error, and of course there would be many because you're going as fast as you can, what you would see bound in the books is they would not, you know, throw sheets away. They would just go ahead and bind it in with the rest of the book, and then they would usually add like a little errata sheet to the finished book. Like, we know there are errors on page 120, 140, 162 or something like that. And sometimes they would not do the errata page, and you would just figure it out yourself as you read the book. So there were a multiple number of jobs, and it's estimated that for any given print shop, you would probably need something like at least 10 people working at once.
Okay, and then I think we'll just do one more for now so we can let you keep going. Someone asked, Gregory asked, the typeface used in the first book, I believe, is remarkably clear and readable after all these hundreds of years. Can you talk a little bit about older typefaces and fonts and their development?
Can I? Okay, so the history of font making is super interesting. One of the things that you come up to is when you are actually creating fonts of type, right? You are actually doing this by hand. Now, the first font maker was Gutenberg's son-in-law, and I'm on screen and I'm totally blanking on his name. Okay, so we have, with the Gutenberg's early fonts, what we have evidence of is basically they're figuring out how to make letters. And during the early period, the early modern period, when you are creating manuscripts by hand, there are a number of acceptable letter forms for each characters that you can see. So for instance, there's 6 kinds of C that are acceptable. There are, 5 kinds of A, 3 kinds of O, actually. We're all pretty solid on what O's are supposed to look like. Anything else can, vary extensively. And so one of the things you're keeping in mind is while you're making physical, the models of type, the matrices, is you are trying to make something that A looks like the letter, B won't be easily cracked when it is being used in the press repeatedly, and you want to have something that's going to be as clear to as many audiences as possible. So thinking about how in the early period, the kind of acceptable scripts kind of varied by country, you could have some form of hiccup in what you were trying to read. This is also why for many, many years, Latin was considered the universal language, because you had a pretty basic Roman alphabet, and you might not know how to read French, German, and Italian, but most people knew how to read Latin. And so that was kind of a workaround in kind of identifying the characters that would be cut. And so the first kind of step towards making your font piece is you would take a length of lead and you would kind of shave it down to make the letter, which is actually very challenging. And then you would flip it over and you would press it into a piece of copper that would become the matrix, and that would become the mold for casting all of your other pieces of type. Another thing that you see for different languages is over time, the ability to get non-Western characters is very challenging. So for instance, when you're looking at the early typesets for Hebrew, that was something that not only required someone who was very cognizant of the Hebrew script and the Hebrew language, but someone who was very adept at cutting those pieces. I possibly told you more than you wanted to know, or maybe not. Yeah.
All right, thanks. We are keeping track of all the questions that are coming in, but we'll let you go on a little bit further and then we'll probably do a few more questions later.
So this is actually one of my favorite things in the collection, and it's very modest. It is a one-sheet broadside. This is printed by Eleanor James, probably around 1715. Eleanor James was a woman printer in London. She ran a printing business with her husband. By day, her husband Thomas would be printing books, and as near as we can tell, by evening, when everyone else had gone home, she would sit in the print shop and she would write these kind of political editorials that she would print on these single sheets of paper. This is printed only on the one side. It's a single sheet. Imagine the kind of flyers that you used to get while walking down the street while people were advertising things. It is something like that. This was meant to be something that would be read one day and that would be wrapped as your fish and chips on the very next day. Eleanor James she had many opinions about the politics of her day. This one from 1715, she is enjoining the Whig and the Tory parties to get along together so their government can function. Now we know how far back that goes. She did something that's known as composing in the stick, and the reason we think this happened is because when she has these arguments, she doesn't kind of come to a conclusion, she just comes to the end of the page where she signs her name. And what composing in the stick means is rather than writing something out and then typesetting it, which is the more traditional model of publishing, what she would do is she would sit with her composing stick and then she would just write in her mind and put the words down, one by one she's going along in this composing stick, and again printing the single sheet of paper. She was super interesting. One of the things of hers that is now lost was an address to other printers. It's estimated that was probably also printed in about 1715. And what she does that's really interesting is she describes herself in that as a printer of above 40 years experience, which means she'd been printing since at least the 1670s. And she addresses all printers as her brothers. We know that she wrote and published this because excerpts of it exist in volumes of literary anecdote from the time period. It was something that a lot of people read and was reprinted a couple of times in volumes where they're quoting her, but the actual original document no longer exists. Although there are about 80 other items that she read that do exist in libraries across the world. I think we have about 3 or 4 examples of these things. One of the things that was also, she was very open-minded about her political opinions in a time when that wasn't something you really did. In the 17th and 18th centuries, there was no such thing as freedom of the press in England. So there were a few times when she would print things and she would go to prison for it. That was something that would happen. She was also the kind of person who would actually get into fights with people on the street. She was an identified figure. People knew who she was and exactly what she thought about literally everything. And there is actually a very famous example where on the street she gets into a fight with Titus Oates, who is one of the fabricators of the Popish plot that was trying to discredit the then monarch. I think it was William. And he was really responsible for fanning a lot of anti-Catholic hate. There were a lot of riots. I think, according to my notes here, 24 people died because of the things that he was writing to discredit various politicians and others. And so she literally gets into a fight with him in the street and says, "Why are you starting all of this unrest? Why are you doing this?" And he beats her with his cane. And he beats her rather significantly, and so she actually sues him. And in kind of, historically women in the courts in England did not always work out that well, but she actually won a lawsuit. He had to pay her damages for this fight that they had in the street that was incredibly, it was rather contentious and well known. Another interesting thing, because she was just a very vocal kind of political writer, there's always the kind of a sentiment of how women in the public sphere are treated and how they are derided. And so there's an example of when her husband is out going to buy supplies. He's going to buy a bunch of paper, and there are accounts of him being lambasted as Eleanor's wife because of his assumed role and the fact that he basically, worked with her and her having what amounts to maybe not her own business, because again, she wasn't really charging for these things. As far as we know, these are things that she was, printing for people to read for free, to kind of disseminate her opinions. And this it's just such an interesting picture of an 18th century marriage to me, that you have these two printers who work together and who are actually really supportive of each other. And I just think that's so great and so kind of contrary to the kind of usual narratives that we have about how early marriages worked. They were true partners in their business. She ends up, after Thomas dies, she continues to write and publish for a number of years. And she also sees to it that his library of books gets donated to libraries. I think there's a portrait of her as well in the National Gallery. I think I should have checked that. That has her seated rather royally with, her books and her pen. And she was just conscious of herself as someone who is kind of engaging in public discourse in a way that I think is really cool.
Hey, Kate.
Yeah.
Someone just requested that you move the image up a little bit, just because the closed captioning is covering the bottom. So just they can see the name at the bottom.
Sure.
Probably a little bit more, I would say.
Let me try moving the document camera. The limitations of technology. Although the side benefit of a document camera is if we were all in a room together, we wouldn't really be able to fit because so many of you are here. Hi. But also we would have to be like jostling around the same table, and at least virtually I'm able to move the camera around so everyone can see. So let's look on the bright side.
All right. Did you want to answer a few more questions now, or did you want to move on?
Sure. I can do a couple more while I set up for the next book.
Okay. Let me just pop up in here. I'm just kind of moving down as they came in. Someone asked, when was printing first started? Before the press?
The earliest printing press, that goes back to the 1450s. Or at least in the West. Let me clarify that. They were printing in China well before that. What you really see over the first couple hundred years is just the kind of shifts in technology. As we go from the kind of really, really big presses, kind of like I showed you earlier in the slides, to kind of smaller ones. A 17th century common press like Eleanor James would have been using would have been about half the size of a Gutenberg one, maybe even a quarter the size, depending on exactly what kind she was using. These are actually very lightweight machines. I went and saw a paper at a conference that actually talked about it, where the idea of there was kind of a period of it was called printing in the hole, where if you were printing material that was on the edge of sedition, on the edge of things that were legal, you would put together your printing press, wherever you could find a little bit of space, and then you would take it apart later. And so there was a kind of question of like, well, how long did that actually take to do? And so members of the Juror Society in England decided to put this to the test. So they built a little wooden press, and then they practiced putting it together and taking it apart again. And they found that they could put it together in about 40 minutes with about 15 minutes of adjustment, and then take it apart in 20 minutes, which I think is fascinating in terms of how you think about treatment of machines in any time period.
All right. If there are no early extant presses, how was a replica of Gutenberg's press constructed?
So there are a lot of images of early presses, and there are also, we just kind of know the kind of historical lineage. So for instance, actually olive oil presses in the West were basically they stayed on that model for like several hundred years. So if you say, okay, I know what an olive oil press looks like, or I know what a grape press looks like up through the 19th century, you can say, okay, I know roughly the dimensions of what this would have looked like. You would also just be able to kind of figure out, okay, I know I need the screw to be about this big in order to move a platen of this size and things like that. There was a set of, in the 1970s, there were a couple of sets of printing press plans that were kind of printed for like public dissemination as a kind of, oh, I'm sorry, I can't think of the words. Is there kind of like a record of the bicentennial because of Benjamin Franklin? And so the idea of like printing presses and how to make them just became something that for a number of years was just a really popular thing to do, and how to play with that.
Okay. We did have one person ask if we could restate the dates and titles of the texts that are being shown in the chat. I don't know if there's an easy way to copy that in just so that people can refer to it.
Okay. Let me do that at the end, actually. I think that will be easier to go through with my notes, and I can pull those out. I should have thought of a list of that ahead of time. If anyone wants to email me, by the way, Cait, C-A-I-T at illinois.edu, I'm happy to send you listings of materials. Boy, howdy. But that might be the easiest way to do is let me type that up at the very, very end.
Great, and we can include any resources you have in our follow-up email tomorrow where we share the recording. So anything that you have will include so people have easy access to it. Let's do, actually, no, we'll move on and then we'll do a few more.
Okay, so I'm going to shift over to America now. There were about a dozen printers, women printers in the American colonies.
Okay, let me do a real quick, easy one. Someone asked, can you talk about the long S?
Sure. Okay, so the long S is actually a scribal holdover. It is a form of creating an S to make less space. And when it comes to printing, one of the things when I was talking about fonts earlier that you want to make sure they don't break off is if you have these kind of bigger S's, it's really easy for bits of those to actually, in the early years, to actually have bits of those crack off. And so the idea of having the smaller S's at the middle meant that it wasn't knocking against the other pieces of type. It was protecting all the pieces that were set together. When you get a couple 100 years later on, you're actually printing with different kinds of metals. You are printing, or early metals for printing used a lot more copper, so the pieces of type were actually much softer. When you get to the 19th century, you see higher proportions of tin and lead, which make it, much sturdier. It can still, break over time, or if you're not careful, but it's just an easier way of actually physically protecting the individual pieces of type.
Yeah, so Cait, the question was phrased, why is F used as an S in the book? So you can tie that together with what you were talking about there. Yeah,
it's not an F, it's an S. It is an S that looks like an F because those very small parts, to us, they look very similar, but actually it'll be easier. Let me switch books real quick. Let me go back to Eleanor James. So this is a word to the wise. Look at how that middle, if this was an F, there would be a little crossbar in the middle, but there's not. So it looks like an F when you look really quickly because we are used to seeing that kind of curve at the top in order to create an F. But if you look at these bits here, this is actually kind of like an S in a slant. And we would know it's an F if it had a crossbar, which this one does not.
Thank you, Cait.
So this is a book by Lydia Bailey. She is a printer in Pennsylvania, and this actually comes up in a really interesting way. This is a third edition of poems on the Revolutionary War by Philip from Now. This is 1809. And what happens is Lydia Bailey is a printer in Philadelphia, and her husband passes away, and he was not a good businessman, so they're left in actually rather dire straits. She's trying to drum up business, and Philip for now actually kind of hears about her, and so he kind of donates the rights to do a 3rd edition of his volume of poetry commemorating the Revolutionary War. It just is a kind of easy way for her to make some money. And she actually does a really good job with this. This is actually the kind of best-selling edition of his poems, which were already really popular. But it helps her very quickly get a significant reputation as someone who is really good at printing, does a really clear job. You can see again it kind of shifts in fonts, as well as on the left-hand side. This is the first example of a book that I'm showing today actually has an illustration. So she's very good at creating very clear, readable text. Now, she's very successful, and she's just a dynamic businesswoman. What she starts doing is she really drums up business really quickly. She transforms a struggling business into a major printing company. Okay, in 1813, she becomes the official city printer for Philadelphia. So she's printing a lot of the government materials that people are using every day. She also acquires significant job printing contracts with the University of Pennsylvania. She's doing a lot of printing, like a lot of printing. One of the really interesting kind of things too is she's also still, for the entirety of her career, which spans about 6 decades, she's a long-standing figure in 19th century American printing. But one of the things that's really interesting that she does is she continues to work hand presses. Literally, while her career is in motion from the 1809 until 1850s, going into the edging into the 1860s, this is a time of dynamic technological transformation. You go from the kind of smaller wooden machines to smaller iron machines to really big machines, ones with really big wheels, things that are meant to do lots and lots of printing really, really quickly. But she does not opt to use the newer technology. We can speculate about that at length, but there's no kind of real answer as to why exactly she wanted to stay with hand presses, particularly given the vast amounts of stuff that she is printing. Again, she has the contracts for the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. She's doing a lot of work. So her decision to kind of shift on that is really interesting, something we can speculate about. This particular copy is really interesting because it's inscribed from her. It's inscribed from her to Joseph H. Siddall, who scholars have identified him as a dry goods merchant. This is dated 1814. This is 8 years after the book's publication, when her business is kind of thriving. So it's kind of interesting. Like, why is she giving this book that's several years old at this point to her grocer? We can speculate, but we don't really know an answer there. But it's just, here's her actual handwriting. I love it. This is something that she's actually, like, we all know that printers touch their books, but in this case, like, she wrote in it. I think that's exciting. Okay, so we're going to fast forward a little bit. We're going to go back to England. This is a little volume called Poems and Offering to Lancashire. This book is from 1863. It is printed by Emily Faithfull at the Victoria Press. The Victoria Press was named as an homage to Queen Victoria. It was an interesting exercise in women's labor rights. The Victorian Press was founded by Faithfull and a number of other women printers as kind of an attempt at making printing a humane industry work for women. During this time period, I showed some of the really images of the steam presses earlier on. This is a time period when doing printing work was dangerous in a way that it had never been before. There were injuries, common injuries included like you could smash and break your fingers while you were pulling papers in and out of moving machinery, in a way that, you know, you control the movement of the earlier hand presses. In the mid-19th century, when you're using steam-powered presses, those machines are working and you're not going to be able to stop them. So if you are too slow in putting paper in or out, you can lose fingers. Again, we're looking at, you know, work days of 12, 14, 16, 18 hours. If you worked at one of the really big printing companies that were the multi kind of storied presses, they're huge. You would be someone who would actually be possibly to like be bent over to be moving things for hours and hours a day. And women who were hired for this work were often young women. They were teenagers or pre-teenagers. By the time they would get to say the age of 18 or so, their backs would be ruined because they'd been spending, you know, long hours, you know, in just gross physical conditions. You also have the issue of women being paid less for their work. That's, you know, per the presidential administration's announcements this week, that's something that still happens. You would also just have, in the 19th century, you did not have any kind of protections with regards to sexual harassment or anything like that. On top of that, you would be working in conditions where, again, high amounts of lead would be in the air. There are gynecological and medical manuals from the time period talking about the unusual numbers of miscarriages, stillbirths, just generally sickliness of people who work with printing presses. They call it printer's colic. And quite often it's also like, well, we know printers are a pale and weakly race. They're just working with the books all the time. It's like, no, it's the high amounts of lead in their workplaces. Emily Faithfull and her colleagues wanted to create a kind of business model that was not incredibly abusive and actually provided fair wages. They set up a system where, you know, a comparatively modest 10 to 12 hour a day, people were given breaks to eat meals, and the women workers were paid on par to what the male workers were paid. This is also kind of interesting for a couple of reasons. First of all, Emily Faithfull has to skip town for a few years, and so she moves from London to San Francisco. She does this because she is involved in a lawsuit involving a well-known divorce case, part of the divorce being because she was caught in bed with the man's wife. And if you've ever wondered about how far back the story of moving to San Francisco is, now you know. San Francisco had the Women's Typographical Union that was among the first of its kind. So she spent 3 years with that union learning how American women typesetters were working, about the way that they were advocating for wage increase, for safety conditions and so forth. So she takes this knowledge back to London to her colleagues, and they start printing. This is also really interesting because this is meant to be a fundraising book for the relief of distress in the cotton districts. The date is 1863. This is reflective of the blockades of shipment of cotton from the American South to England during the Civil War. When those blockades happen, industry supply jams. Basically, there are entire towns of cotton workers that go out of business and on the dole overnight. It was a massive kind of industrial calamity, like thousands and thousands and thousands of people no longer had wages, they no longer had materials. It just really throws things into tumult. And this book was printed as an exercise in gathering funds to kind of help relieve industrial workers who had been laid off. And it talks about how easy it was to put this book together with the Victoria Press. Miss Faithfull undertook to print and publish 1,000 copies free of expense. The compositors of the Victoria Press volunteering their services. So that meant that they are doing free work and they're doing a lot of work. The average print run of a book during this time was 500. They're ponying up for 1,000 copies ahead of time in order to raise money. So doing that while they're at the same time trying to advocate for wage increase and so forth is really interesting. And it's also a collection. You have a lot of really well-known people who are contributing their poetry to this volume. You have George MacDonald, you have Dante Gabriel Rossetti, you have Christina Rossetti, a lot of people of note in the literary scene of that time period trying to contribute to this effort that is being done by the Victoria Press. So I think that's really cool.
I don't know if we want to do another break for questions or if we have just a little bit more left that we need to do and then do questions. You let me know.
Yeah, let me do one last book and then we will let loose on the question and answers. So we are now moving into the early 1900s, and we are moving away from, well, not fully away from, but we're looking at more what we would consider kind of like the pre-artist books. The arts and crafts movement, known by probably most famous when you look at the work of William Morris and others, is trying to kind of bring back this really nice handmade sensibility to works. And so this is a book, a poem by William Butler Yeats. It's done by the Dunhammer Press. The press during that time consisted of his sisters and some of their neighbors. And what they were trying to do is do hand press printing that's just beautifully done. And they're also trying to kind of recall this kind of early medieval sensibility. They have, you know, the red and the black, they're set apart. This is Yeats's poem In the Seven Woods. It's also kind of a little bit of a play, but they alternate in black and red in a very eye-catching way, and it would be familiar to people who have seen texts from the Renaissance period and earlier. And one of the things I think is super interesting, they put a colophon in the back, which is more of a, this is something that you see in incunables and in medieval books. This is kind of like the credit sequence for who did the work on the book. This was replaced by what we now think of as kind of like the copyright page. We saw that with the Charlotte Guillard example. The idea of like, where are things printed and who did it? And so here, they're also, you know, you have the women who are working on it, Elizabeth Corbett Yates, in the house of Evelyn Gleeson. It's in Dundham in the county of Dublin, Ireland, finished the 16th day of July in the year of the big wind. And the year of the big wind it just sounds like super romantic, doesn't it? And I did a little bit of research on this. The big wind was just a tremendous windstorm. It was basically a really bad hurricane. It was the worst storm to hit Ireland in 300 years. The night that happened, several hundred people died. Over 40 ships were wrecked. There was massive property damage throughout the country. So this kind of romantic thing is also just a really kind of dramatic thing. It's like, you know, if we published a book and we said in the year of the pandemic, you know, at the time of, you know, Hurricane Ike or something like that. It's kind of tying in very clearly with like the modern events that kind of preoccupied the period. It's just a very beautiful book. So that is the last thing I pulled, and we can start going to more Q&A. If people want a closer look at some of the books, I can bring them back out. Oh, I also wanted, before I forget, let me drop this. I did not think about sharing a list of the items I'd made today, which is very silly of me, but I did put together a bibliography of books about the people that I talked about today. So if you're interested in Melissa Conway's transcription of the Diario, if you're interested in reading more about Charlotte Guillard, about Eleanor James, Lydia Bailey, Emily Faithfull, the Yates sisters, these are some really good books on those topics. And the last idea I want to kind of put out there is I deliberately chose as kind of case studies really well-known women printers. There are so many more that are out there, hundreds and thousands, but because of the vagaries of history, because of the problems of documentation, it's very hard to really draw out a story when sometimes all that exists is a name and a place. So I kind of want to reinforce that when we're talking about doing reparative work, about recovery work, the bias is always going to be on the people who were famous or wealthy or something like that first, because they have the most documentation. And so the kind of challenge to us as scholars is to kind of draw out the stories behind the people who aren't documented. How can we do that? How can you go back and find all of the other hundreds and thousands of women printers over the years? I think there's ways to do it, but it's just work that needs to be done.
All right, we have a handful of questions to get through, and just so everybody knows, I'll obviously include Cait's contact information, excuse me, in our follow-up email, so she is happy to answer questions that we don't have time for today. The first one I have from closer to the beginning is kind of funny. Someone said the Zoom caption technology translated your first group of printers as Ripoli Nuns. So they wanted to clarify who those nuns really were and what order they belonged to.
Yes, so the Ripoli Nuns, Ripoli, they were an order in just outside of Florence. They were at the Church of St. James of Ripoli, and I'm going to turn my document camera back on so you can kind of see. I'll show you the colophon at the end. This is printed in Florence at St. Jacob of Ripoli. It's a little town. I think it's kind of been caught up in the modern urban sprawl of Florence today, but I think historically it would have been just outside the city.
All right, next one is, how many books and tracts do you think were published by 1500? This person read 20 million. Can that be possible?
Yes. So it's known, I think, if I'm recalling correctly, it's thought there were about 25,000 editions of titles during those years. And then you have to end up with the math of trying to kind of figure out how many copies per edition. So let's say 350 to 500. I can't do math off the top of my head, but there are, I think, something about like the number I'm going to throw out. I think that there's something on par of, I'm trying to think how many survive today. I want to say it's something like 2 million that are held in libraries across the world. Here at U of I, we're super lucky. We have about 1,300 incunables. That is a kind of rather staggering number for a single institution that, you know, wasn't built in 1500, to be honest. But one of the things you kind of have to think about is it's been 500 years, just a natural wear and tear of things. There's a lot that is lost. There's another way of kind of thinking about it is just, you know, all of the, it's not just like the kind of natural way of things falling apart. Like, for instance, this is an item that's been rebound. This is not the original cover. The original, as it survives, is, you know, this small number of pages, right? And so any book that survives for several hundred years, each one is just a minor miracle, to be honest, because that means that it has survived through political upsets, natural disasters, just being used repeatedly. Okay, think about, you know, the number of paperbacks you have at home, and they're probably tattered because you've read them a lot, right? It's just the kind of natural survivability. And so we have to look at the numbers that survive and kind of use our best judgment to kind of figure out the numbers that would have been extant at the time.
Okay. This is an interesting one. To what extent were printers involved in bookbinding? Can you say something about the types of bindings that were used, hollow or tight?
Sure. So for several hundred years, bookbinding is actually a separate industry from printing. You, as someone purchasing a book, would just buy your sheets of paper. You would buy this little stack. It probably would not even come ordered for you. It would come ordered as it was printed with multiple pages printed on a single sheet of paper. And what you would do is you would buy that stack of pages and you would take them to a bookbinder. And it would be up to you to pick what your binding would be. And so if you are perhaps like me, you're a simple, humble scholar, your cheapest option would be, just some cheap paper covers. And what you might do is just buy the sheet of slightly nicer paper and then do the sewing yourself. If you are someone wealthier, you might put leather on it. If you're someone who is tremendously, grotesquely wealthy, you're going to put on leather. That leather is going to be tooled with gold. You might throw in your family arms on top of that, because why not? It's not unusual during the early period to actually give books feet, little kind of knobs on the back cover so that your actual book would not, touch the surface of anything. It would have feet to keep it off the ground, because you take your book care very seriously. So these are two separate industries. It's not until probably late 19th into the early 20th century when these things come together. If you look at, there's a really interesting book that came out a few years ago on Blanche Knopf. She was one of the co-founders of Knopf Press in the 1920s. And in the early years before they became the successful behemoth that they are today, one of the things they would be doing is she and her husband would be actually sewing the books at home at night, because that was the way that they were keeping on top of being able to make shipments on time, and to be able to keep costs low, because they were doing a lot of the early work themselves.
Great. And we are at just almost 1 o'clock. So we are almost at the end of this event. I don't know if you'd be willing to answer a few more questions, or you prefer that
I can go as long as I want me to. Probably longer than anyone wants.
Well, we'll get through some more of these questions then. Someone asked, we typically associate early manuscripts with monasteries, excuse me, but is there more evidence of female religious communities working in presses and or early manuscripts?
That's a good question. Okay, so this one actually came out a couple weeks ago, and I will add specific information for Hannah when she makes that follow-up email, because I can't think of it off the top of my head, but there is actually a new database of women scribes that's being worked on. And it's to kind of try to, again, uncover the histories of all of these women that we do not know. And what you find, for instance, I was told many moons ago that, there weren't many women printers and they didn't really do that much and so forth. And then I started working on the women book history bibliography. And it turns out if you actually just go back and start pulling out materials and tracing footnotes and books and so forth, you actually start coming across massive amounts of data. And again, this is just the tip of the iceberg. This is the stuff that people know versus what we don't know. And so when you're just going through books after books, just trying to pull out names, that's a challenge of itself. So first of all, identifying who the people are, where they were, versus the things that were always said, right? In this case, the Ripoli Nuns are very well known because, again, their records survive, and their records survive in a unusually complete way for the history of time. Think about all of the records that either don't survive or were probably never made. It's very kind of difficult to kind of look beyond that. I'm not a medievalist, so I can't give any kind of estimation about numbers and so forth, but I mean, nuns were some of the literate women for hundreds of years. We do know that they did do things and make them in some cases and sell them, and trying to kind of pull out the further information, that's work that just needs to be done, and people are doing it.
Great. So we had a question about the I think the Bailey work. Mm-hmm. Did Lydia Bailey, a novel by Kenneth Roberts, draw inspiration from this printer?
Could be. I don't know that book at all. Sorry. I'm
so
going
maybe.
to look it up later.
All right. Another Bailey one. Would Bailey have had multiple hand presses. Would printing firms need to have multiple hand presses to produce at that level?
Yes. And actually, so one of the things that you can kind of track is number of presses if the records survive. So let me check my notes. Charlotte Guillard worked at one of the larger concerns, and I think when I'm looking to see if I've noted how many press, okay, she owned 4 or 5 printing presses with up to 25 employees, as well as running a bookshop. So she had a pretty good sized business going. One of my favorite women printers from 17th century England is Mary Simons. Mary Simons ran the largest concern in England for a number of years. We know this because she had 4 printing presses. Her building had 13 hearths, which we know about from the hearth tax records, when you would be taxed by the number of fireplaces that you had before we had centralized heating. And she had something along the lines of 40 to 60 workers at a time. And these the evidence of this survives in the Stationer Company records in the Stationer Guildhall of London. So Lydia Bailey, I do not know off the top of my head how many printing presses she would have had, but she would have had multiples. Again, she was the city printer of Philadelphia and a contract printer for the University of Pennsylvania Press, amongst other businesses. So she had a sizable printing concern as well.
All right. Someone asked, were there more women in printing during the arts and crafts movement?
Maybe. So here's the thing about when you're kind of comparing things, is that there's always kind of both kind of in history kind of ups and downs as to what is happening to women legally. So one of the really interesting things in the 17th century is that women printers are allowed to go through the guild apprenticeship system for the first time, starting in the 1660s. What that means is that your parents would buy you kind of an entrance into the guild. You would be formally trained for a period of 4 to 7 years, and then you would kind of graduate as a journeyman at the end of this period of time, and would be able to locate work on your own. It is not known why women all of a sudden are able to do something in the 1660s versus that previous period of time. Likewise, what you see is during a kind of period of when the guild system is falling out of favor in the early 18th century, the number of women printers goes down, also because shifts in technology and, early kind of pre-industrialization, women are not being paid as much for their work, and they're actually being pushed into kind of bookbinding, which is not considered at the time to be kind of like socially like mobile or something like that. There is a book that I'm trying to remember the title, but anyway, they're talking about how little skill is needed for bookbinding and how cheap it is to do it, and that's why women are great at it, because they can do it for hours and they don't cost anything. And so this kind of respectability, this kind of cost and so forth is tied in. When you get to the arts and crafts movement, what's different there is that these are, this is very much a middle class activity. This is an artisanal activity. This is very different from, industrial production. And so the women who are doing this are very good. They have training, they're so forth. The Yates sisters are actually the ones keeping the family afloat, but they are also, the kind of bohemian family. Basically, if I recall correctly, like their dad decides to go off and be a painter and just totally leaves the family for a while. And so the women are the ones who have to step up and kind of keep food on the table and so forth. And so they're doing that with their printing business.
All right, we only had one more question. And this person asked if you could provide some sources to research window printers or widow printers. I read widow printers. And I don't know if you have any right off the bat, or if that's something you'd want to include in a follow-up.
Sure. So first place to look would be the Women Book History Bibliography at womensbookhistory.org. Some other places, I mean, it's one of those things where you come again to the problem of trying to untangle the history of women. In some cases, where you've got to go is actually directly to the original records because other people haven't gotten there yet. Womensbookhistory.org is probably good first stop shop. I will take some poking around, see if I can find anything specific, but there's the other thing you could possibly think about looking at would be going directly to something like, oh gosh, now I'm trying to remember. There's the City Rolls of London where you can search for the women who are in the different guilds and things. But as I was talking, I cannot remember if the Stationers Guild is in the City Rolls yet. They were going to add it at some point, but I don't know if they're in yet. So good, great question. Not too sure of too many things off the top of my head, actually.
Well, thank you. That looks like it's all the questions that we have. And again, I'll include your contact information in our follow-up email in case anyone thinks of anything after the fact. And there will also be a recording of this uploaded onto the Library Friends website either this afternoon, if not tomorrow. And I just wanted to remind everyone again, we have our next webinar in April. It will be on the 22nd. It's another one with Jennifer Tepper, this time on the preservation of photographs by popular demand. And we'll be sending out an invitation for that as well very soon. So I wish you all have a great rest of your day and be on the lookout for an email from us tomorrow. Thank you.